International professionals and nonprofit organizations, businesses, and global teams often deliver presentations across cultures and national borders. But how to bridge theory and practice in teaching public speaking skills to global professionals in modern contexts? What are the cultural and linguistic considerations? Please welcome Professor Dan Bullock and Professor Raul Sanchez.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very excited to welcome you to the very first World Higher Education Ranking Summit. And today we are joined by industry leaders, changemakers, government officials, policy innovators, and people that shape a better world. And I'm really honored because today we are joined by extraordinary people, by leaders in their field, by those people that are shaping better mind for students around the world. Professor Raul Sanchez is an award-winning clinical assistant professor and the corporate program coordinator at New York University School of Professional Studies. What is more, he has designed and delivered corporate trainings for Deloitte and the United Nations, as well as been a writing consultant for Barnes & Noble Press and PBS. Raul was awarded the New York University School of Professional Study Teaching Excellence Award, and he specializes in linguistics and business communication. He contributes to Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, Quartz, Yahoo News, Fast Company, HuffPost, Business Insider, and so many more incredible outlets. So Raul is actually the leader in public communication, and we are really honored to have you here. Thank you so much for joining the WEST conference, Raul.
Thank you, Angelica. I appreciate the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here.
And what is more, we are joined by Dan Bullock. And Dan, it's a great pleasure to see you here. And it's a great honor to interview you both. Let me tell our audience a little bit about you. So Dan actually is a language and communication specialist and trainer at the United Nations Secretariat, training diplomats and global UN staff. He also serves as faculty teaching business communication, linguistics and public relations within the Division of Programs in Business at New York University School of Professional Studies. And Dan was the director of corporate communication at a leading New York City public relation firm, and his corporate clients have included TD Bank and Pfizer. He contributed to Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, Yahoo News, and other amazing outlets. And it's really amazing because you co-authored the book together, right, Dan and Raul? And the book is called How to Communicate Effectively with Anyone. This is brilliant. First of all, congratulations on this book. And I know that this is extremely important and handy guide to help many people across the globe how to communicate effectively. Would you be so kind to tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely. And we can start with the importance of a global mindset, because I think this gives us an entry point to the book. And essentially, almost imagine ourselves, right, all of us, zooming away from the Earth into this overview perspective. And it's said that the most powerful cognitive shift can happen when an astronaut turns back in space flight to view the Earth. In this moment, all clouds of difference part, and we see this fragile planet that we all share, and this is called the overview effect. And the idea is bringing this global mindset to a global skill set on the Earth. Thinking about connecting perception to specific behavioral skills. And this is why one of the most influential photographs ever taken was the photograph Earthrise. This was captured by the astronauts on the Apollo 8 mission as they were about to enter lunar orbit, and they turned back to look at the Earth. And it was said to have gone as close to viral as an image could at the time. It was flooded by international media across the planet because it was the first time that we'd seen this fragile planet that we share hanging there in space, the loneliness, the beauty of our planet, and the first time we'd seen it as an interconnected system. And that shift in consciousness was so powerful. They said that photograph actually started the environmental movement at the time. So this is the crux of the book, is bringing that global mindset to a global skill set, seeing patterns of communication all over the globe, And navigating those patterns is the path of the global communicator. And so in the book, every chapter focuses on a specific skill. We start with public speaking as the first one. We go into networking, and then all the way up to negotiation, and then strategic writing in the global marketplace. But again, thinking about connecting perception to behavioral skills, this is the crux of the book, but overall, the general approach to global communication. And so this is, that shift in consciousness is as important as the actual practical things that we do in our, not just our work together, but also building more powerful relationships with one another as human beings.
This is absolutely powerful because today's topic is importance of enhancing communication skills among students. And I'm very honored and privileged to be joined by world's best experts in this field. And I am 100% sure that today's session will generate a huge, not only insights, not only interest, but will give practical tools to the audience that is watching us today on how to enhance their skills. Because today we're joined by staff, by members of faculty, by deans, by presidents of different universities, and by students. And it's so important to introduce new practices to improve students' communication. What I've seen across the globe in different universities, in the Middle East, in the UK, in the US, there is the same situation. Students are equipped with knowledge, but they are very rarely they can really present themselves in the best way. And this is a very important tool, as you know, for everything. As you, Raul, just mentioned, this is so important to have this tool in our daily life to build powerful relationships with one another. So my next question is, it seems that the very first step in effective global communication is global mindset and respect for people of other cultures, ethnicities, and backgrounds. On a very basic level, what role does a global mindset play in becoming an effective global communicator? And this question is really important because we are joined by audience from all over the world, and we see people from different backgrounds. And how do we make this communication effective when there's so many different cultures, different religions, different ethnicities? How do we become global communicators?
Sure, I can kick this one off, and then I'm going to pass it to Professor Bullock too, as well, who may have some points in this area. So as we started with the overview effect, very important. And as you mentioned, in the globalized era, communication skills are more important than ever, particularly presentation skills. Successful presenters not just think about the subject they're presenting, but also their audiences, thinking about shifting from information to communication, right? We all have multicultural teams to motivate, international clients to engage, and global partners that we're collaborating with, and they all have diverse needs and diverse communication styles. So, but again, thinking about the global mindset, we're not just thinking about productivity or effective business communication. We're thinking in a larger sense of authentic human relationships. How do we deepen those? And then how can we bridge commonalities between us as human beings? Not thinking about working more effectively with one another, but relating more deeply with one another. And this interdependence, this is the mindset that leads to the adaptability that we need for global communication to occur. And Professor Bullock.
Sure, and then something I might add, I mean, there's so much that goes into perception, right? So working on the international stage, so to speak, working with intercultural communications, we have to think of cultures almost like a mosaic, right? So a mosaic which forms a unique set of patterns, and we're trying to tap into each of those patterns and connect in some way, shape, or form. It's not just about communicating. It's about connecting and really creating this understanding, this shared understanding between us, expanding perceptions beyond that, having this sense of mindfulness. Something that we both teach in classes and in trainings at the same time is Raul touched on something that's very important. And sometimes this can get lost in translation, but the audience is so key to everything that we do as communicators. You, me, anyone else, right? It does not matter what role that we perform in. But the idea is we have to understand our audience first. That's where everything starts. The audience dictates on how you're going to frame information. Framing allows us to bridge these gaps, right? And really connect with somebody in terms of sharing perception. So audience, we really need to also focus on something else at the same time. And this is something that we focus on in terms of the trainings is purpose, right? Now, whenever we think about purpose, there are really two types of purposes out there. Either somebody's looking for information, or somebody's trying to persuade, right, or convince somebody of their point of view. So it goes back into this almost like feedback loop that we're trying to create. So audience and purpose are very key. Both of those will inform the message, whatever message that is that you're trying to pass along to an intercultural community, right? But the fourth element in that would be value, right? And many times we tend to start thinking of, okay, well, what do I need out of the situation? Or how do I position something in order to get the response that I want, right? And Professor Sanchez has talked a lot about, or he's hinted on a few things that we have in the book in terms of mirroring aspects. We talk a little bit about framing content for more persuasive appeal. Persuasion is a growing field of science, right? And people are trying to understand, how do we connect more, not just communicate, but to connect. But the idea is value is so important that it's more about the other person. And we have to have this shift in mindset where we are in service to the other person. So I would say to really connect with a larger global community, there's no playbook, right, for communicators in the 21st century. But the idea is, if we all can start to shift our mindsets a little bit, start focusing on the other person, right, then I think that we will start to be on the trajectory towards naturally evolving into a community that can really connect with people across the world.
Professor Bullock, Professor Sanchez, these are some brilliant points, because it's so important not to just give the information, but also understand the value you're giving and to connect with the audience. And this is one of the problems that many people have. They have those blocks. Once they are talking to the audience or talking to their classmates, doesn't matter. It is the block that someone is in their own bubble. And it's very interesting how you approach it. So first, you become a listener. You are out there, you are out of your bubble, you're interacting with the audience, and that's how you are becoming more successful. My next question would be actually about the principles. What are the communication skills principles across different industries that students require to learn, those essential skill sets and principles that are so important for a successful communicator?
Sure. And Professor Bullock,
Go ahead.
You want to? Okay. So this actually. So Angelica, you're cued in right exactly with our frame of thought here. So this is actually exactly what Professor Bullock just said in terms of purpose, audience, value, message. And there's, and we're going to connect these soon, with very, very practical sort of hands-on tips. But one thing that I would like to add to that is something that you just mentioned about focusing on the audience and being an active listener. And every presentation is an opportunity to change the world. And, we think about change as a starting point, but when we're thinking about change in a speaking opportunity, whether we're presenting to a small group of coworkers or a conference room, or there's a larger plenary situation, the goal of any presentation is to ignite change between the presenter and the audience. But we are not the source of change, right? This is an important principle. We are the facilitator of change. So we're the catalyst, right? We're the spark. If the audience is the marathon runner, we are the guy on the side giving them the water as they run the race, right? So, and this is a shift in mindset, but it's very important, because once the audience is the centerpiece, this is when we get to cultivate that adaptability that we need for switching communication styles, for cultivating a space of empathy and respect. Once the audience becomes the hero of the presentation, not ourselves, everything we do shifts. And this is how we can arrive at effective intercultural communication. We're not even nervous anymore, because we're delivering an idea in service to others. It's not in service to ourselves, right? We're giving that idea in service to others. We want to spark something in the audience. So that mindset shift is very important as a principle before we engage in the act of global communication.
I love this. This is just brilliant, because it's like when you serve to a purpose that is higher than yourself, your personal limitations are broken because you're connected to the purpose, and that's how you're confident in your presentation. You do not think about you in the first place. You think about the purpose that you're serving. And what do you think about this, Professor Bullock?
Sure, yes, absolutely. Everything comes back to the aspects of audience and purpose, right? And something else that Professor Sanchez touched on is the way that we're presenting the information. Beyond just the diction, so the word choice, the way that we're framing things in terms of what I was saying earlier, it comes down to also being able to kind of speak the language, right? So speak the language in terms of the global communicator. So what this means is something that we touch on a lot in terms of our classes and trainings and just different meetings altogether is something called global English. Now, global English refers to English usage that a professional speaker, could be a writer, for example, at the same time, in terms of what they use to optimize for a global audience. Now, we have to think about it this way. Across the world, English serves as, or global English serves as the international business communication standard, right? And if we were to further define what global English is, right, it's clear and concise usage that does not assume fluency of others, right? But it might just be a more easier way to think about this is, well, what is not global English? It tends to become more clear whenever we start to think about these different aspects that we just commonly tend to integrate in terms of our own presentation style, our own way of drafting an email, our own way of conducting a meeting. And Professor Sanchez, I think, has a couple words that he can share with that.
Hi, I apologize. I was muted for a second. I was trying to enlarge in the video. So absolutely. So in terms of linguistic strategies, sometimes it's easier to understand what global English is by thinking about what it's not. And as Professor Bullock said, this is something that has come of recent importance to multinational entities, organizations, thinking about the English that we all speak. There's many varieties in the world. There's British English, as we know, Australian, there's American English, but this is the international language of business. And so how do we make it more clear, but not simplify, And so there's some tips for what is non-global English. Non-global English would be idioms. So that's one example. Idioms are those groups of words that have a different meaning from the individual words. So something like off the top of my head or cut and dry, let's come up for air. These do not translate culturally and internationally the same way. Also cultural references. So Americans tend to love references to baseball. So let's say this came out of left field. Let's bring our A game to this. Let's level the playing field. So unless the cultural reference is international or universally recognizable, then we should only steer towards those references that global audiences would readily grasp and hold on to. Initialisms and acronyms. So initialisms are where you pronounce every separate letter in an abbreviation, like FBI. Acronyms are when a name or word is formed from the letters, like NATO. So we want to make sure that if we're using those abbreviations, that we make sure to indicate what they are and not just speak in a stream of abbreviations, which tends to happen in governmental organizations or multinational corporations. And the last would be phrasal verbs. So these are verbs that are made up of 2 or 3 words, such as draw up, draw up the contract, or get ahead, or zero in on. And these can be also quite challenging. So instead, it's recommended to use a single verb. So instead, in our trainings at NYU and at the UN, instead of saying draw up the contract, we recommend saying write the contract or draft the contract. And then sarcasm. We never want to say the opposite of what we mean, because that's what sarcasm is. So if you say, beautiful day, isn't it? And it's actually the opposite. Or if you say, well, that's just what we need, and in fact, it's exactly what we don't need, this can be difficult. So instead of sarcasm, it's recommended with global English to use the language of empathy, use pronouns such as we and us to create collective goals and inclusivity.
And if I could maybe just add a point here, just to put it in further context as well. Whenever we think of, for example, the International Space Station, right? It's up there, it's orbiting the sky. It's essentially a lab, right? We have 15 nations, we have 5 agencies, and it's a shared one vision, right? So there has to be a lot of collaboration that takes place. There has to be effective communication aboard this International Space Station in order for things to get done effectively, right? Just think of the many issues that we're trying to solve on this planet: climate change, sequencing the human genome, for example. It could even be with COVID-19. There has to be some collaborative quality and being able to communicate that, but even going beyond that, connecting with audiences so they see the gravity of situations that we're trying to overcome can be just as important. And global English helps us connect in a more literal sense, just so that there's no misunderstanding, just so there's no misinterpretation, things like that.
This is essential because many entrepreneurs, academics, they refer to sarcasm, to phrasal verbs in their presentations to the global audience. I've witnessed this. Your advice is vital because this can actually ruin the relationships with the audience. And the tone, it's not about being tone deaf. It's just about understanding that your audience comes from different background, and respecting that is a key. And my next question would be about storytelling. Everyone is a storyteller, but what do you think is the role of storytelling in intercultural communication and public speaking? How important is storytelling in actually addressing certain issues effectively?
That's a great question, because storytelling stories are one of the most important vehicles for communication, especially transculturally. And we come from the field of psycholinguistics, and so I'm a little bit of a nerd in this area. I'm very fascinated by how language and thought intersect, and that is essentially what psycholinguistics is. But when we are receiving facts, there are two areas of the brain that light up. There's the Broca's area and I say Wernicke's, I think it's Wernicke. This is a German term, but this other area of our brain that lights up. And these two areas are just responsible for the language processing. When we receive the same information in the form of stories, there's the motor cortex that lights up, there's the visual cortex, the cerebellum, auditory, all these other sensory areas light up. And so, this goes back to research by Dr. Yuri Hassan at Princeton University, and this is fairly recent. They're researching the neurological basis of human communication and storytelling. And what they found was something incredibly remarkable, that when we are delivering a powerful story, we share nearly identical brainwave activity with the audience. And what they did was they hooked up audience members to MRI machines and storytellers, and they found that our brains essentially get in sync through the act of storytelling. And this reveals something that we've known intuitively for a long time, as you just mentioned, that stories are the most powerful transcultural vehicle for communication. And whether we're in the boardroom, a virtual room, a conference room, these are sort of metaphorical campfires that we can use this universal process to make our ideas more relatable and then achieve greater collaboration. And there's some tips that we have in the book that I think we can share. And I know Professor Bullock has some as well. So I'll share just to make this more practical. How do we achieve this mind-to-mind connection? I'm sure people are wondering, we get this question a lot. Now we know that this research exists, but how do we do it in a practical way? One is that you can bond with your audience over a professional or social or personal cause. So for all of us listen to stories with our hearts more than our minds, because we're looking for messages that align with our values. So for example, if you can pick a core value in your presentation, such as integrity or empathy or honesty, and then build a story around it, this is how you can expand your stories from personal to human experience. It could be a value in your presentation that you are bringing up, or it could be a organizational value, but this is one way to connect those stories with values that resonate. The other is highlighting a shared challenge or overcoming a common goal. So, and this one is one that I tend to use a lot. How can a story illustrate a choice that you want the audience to make? So you think of a powerful decision-making moment in your life, and then how can the audience then make that similar decision in their lives? This is another key area. And the third is data. If you can make a presentation bigger in meaning than the data, telling a story around the data, this is a powerful way to use storytelling in the presentation. And Professor Bullock sends me a lot of interesting articles because he's a very avid reader. And one title resonated with me that he sent me. The title of the article was "Data Without the Human Soul is Meaningless." And this is very true, that without us, without human beings, data is just numbers, right? There's no trend, there's no prediction, there's no forecasting. So this is another way to use storytelling, is building a narrative around the data. And then there's also some patterns. I know Professor Bullock, has a lot to say about that in terms of some narrative patterns that may work.
Yeah. So there's really like six that stand out in terms of these narrative patterns. If you think about it, people across the world are uptaking what's called cognitive load, right? So to further understand the information, where does the main idea fall? Is it at the beginning, at the end? This comes down to what's called high context and low context cultures, which is something that we can talk about here in a moment. But these patterns, for example, one universal pattern that tends to be across many cultures is the monomyth. Right. So the monomyth, for example, it was further researched by a person, and his name is Joseph Campbell, with a book, A Hero with a Thousand Faces. Right. And then the idea with this monomyth is that somebody goes and sets out on a journey. They find some additional information, and then they come back with this newfound wisdom in order to share with everyone. We see it in movies. We see it in different contexts, conversations. Just think of, for example, The Lion King. For example, it could be Star Wars. Many people are familiar with these movies, and that's the type of storytelling pattern that's taking place. Now the monomyth myth is very good for taking the audience, walking through a journey of some sort. Just think of how we might present something in a boardroom, right, or within a meeting. It could also be effective in terms of showing the benefit of taking risks, right? I know within a lot of the trainings that both of us contribute to, a lot of people tend to want to point out, okay, well, what was the challenge? How did I overcome it? We almost have this problem solution dynamic happening. At the same time, it's about demonstrating what you learned along the way. Okay. And then Professor Sanchez, I'm not sure if you had another one. If not, I'm sure I can speak on another one.
Well, I think monomyth is great. I mean, I know that, you're essentially the heroes going out into the unknown and coming back with some newfound knowledge or wisdom, and this can be quite powerful. You can structure a memo this way. You can structure a presentation in any topic this way. Another one would be, there's a few in the book that we have. I'm trying to think of which one I should say, because I know we don't have time to do all of them. False start is another one as well. So false start, essentially, what you're doing is you reveal in a seemingly predictable way, and then you shift and disrupt audience expectations and reveal a new message. And this is something that even, famous example, J.K. Rowling did in her Harvard commencement speech. Everybody thought she was going to speak about her success as a writer. And she started with, today I'm going to talk to you about the benefits of failure. And everybody just, you could see the audience react visibly, thinking, this is graduation day. What is she doing? This is supposed to be the happiest day of my life. We don't want to think about failure. But then what it does is when you do that shift, you reveal a new message. And what she revealed was that you will face obstacles in your life, but you can overcome those, with certain tips that she was giving, certain ideas of resiliency and so on. So it becomes quite an inspirational speech after that. And, that's another one. And there's, Professor Bullock, do you want to do one more?
I'll do one more because for completion's sake, right? Like three things make a trend, right? So
yes, please.
Yeah. Yes, another one. Thank you. Yeah. So one that is a personal favorite of mine is called in medias res. Okay. So what this means is you drop the audience directly in the middle of the action, right? So for example, and I guess I'm just full of films today, but the idea is many of us might be familiar with the James Bond 007 movies, right? What happens at the beginning of the movie? You are launched straight into the action, right? What's happening? All these questions come to mind. Why is this person running away? Things like that. The same thing can happen in our presentations or perhaps a memo writing. It's the way that we draw somebody in and grab their attention, the hook, for example, is what's going to be very powerful. Again, you want people to be asking questions. You want to pique their curiosity, for example. The idea about this, and this goes back to what Professor Sanchez was saying in terms of neurocoupling, right? So we're trying to build out this aspect of curiosity because that's really what the reward is. It comes down to really helping people achieve, I guess, this overall sense of well, what's happening next. Again, it's something, whether you are, for example, and you all know that I'm also a publicist at the same time, but the idea in terms of getting the attention of maybe somebody from the media or getting the attention from a new business client. So this in medias res can really go a long way. And this is very useful. And one key point that I like to point out with this is it's very useful, especially if you have a few people presenting something at the same time. You're trying to thread through, right, the same kind of story in a sense, right? So for example, it would be, so dropping somebody into the action, and then maybe you move on to these other components, which then translates into another pattern in itself, the pedal structure. Anyways, there's many things that we can talk about in terms of storytelling, but the idea is, in media res, a really great one to keep the audience's attention and focus attention on pivotal moments.
This is so important. I mean, Professor Bullock, Professor Sanchez, these are some some keys to effective communications. The secrets are just given out here at the conference. And what I'm thinking when you were talking, Professor Sanchez, about the neuroscience, the coupling between, it's so fascinating. Basically, the way we talk about our story is actually something that affects other people, and how we present it's not only about us at that moment, it's about our audience. So science has actually proved this. This is spectacular, because what we do with this information, basically, we need to understand that we as human beings, we thrive through storytelling, because as I think that Yuval Noah Harari, he mentioned this in Homo Sapiens, that through language, right, through storytelling, our whole civilization managed to thrive. And that's what I'm thinking about, is the effective storytelling for students should be a master class, should be something that is put in the curriculum. But we do not see this in across the world. There are some institutions that see public speaking as a part of the curriculum. But what do you think? Do you think this is something that every student has to learn, and or do you think this should be something that they should do out of their own desire?
That's a great question, and again, you're right. You're right on the pulse. Your fingers on the pulse of what's happening in the moment, because a lot of companies are seeking training in narrative strategies. And I just did a training for Anheuser-Busch last summer, and they requested a training in narrative strategies for writing memos. And so the overall training was called Persuasive Writing for the Globalized Marketplace. But they did want narrative strategies infused in that, and it's so important. I think a lot of businesses are starting to see this in terms of effective practices, interweaving storytelling, whether it is in marketing or, as Professor Bullock mentioned, public relations. And there's one example that to give a business example, there's another pattern that we didn't mention earlier, but this is one that could relate here to this moment here, is global spark lines. And so this is one of the most powerful discourse patterns for the most resonant speeches in the world. And essentially, and thinking of a Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, or Steve Jobs' speech when the iPhone was introduced to the world. This speech, essentially, this pattern is, you're contrasting an ideal world with the ordinary world. So you're going back and forth. And these are called spark lines, right? So, for example, Martin Luther King talked about the red hills of Georgia, and then he said, "But I have a dream that one day we will sit at the table of brotherhood." Then he talked about the sweltering heat of oppression, "But I have a dream." And the entire speech goes back and forth between this ordinary world and this ideal world, until at the end you get to the vision. And Steve Jobs did the same. He talked about our previous phones that limited us, but then there was this new iPhone, and then he goes back. And this stems from research by Nancy Duarte. She's, I think, a CEO of Duarte Design. And then in our book, we expand it to the global context. And so thinking about, doing this pattern in a global way, where you're expanding the context globally and internationally in terms of cultural references and messaging. But storytelling is quite powerful, and companies are picking up on this. And I think, as you mentioned, students need to know this earlier, so that they have those future of work skills that they will need. And sometimes people tend to focus on, the skills that are a little bit more tangible, like presentation skills, negotiation skills, and those span fields and industries. But before that, you still need those sort of sub tools in there, and storytelling is one of the most powerful. And Professor Bullock?
Sure. I think that you've touched on a lot of it right there. Global spark lines is so important today, because again, just creating this appeal. And I think people have to hear something reinforced a few times. At least this comes from the field of public relations as well. But the idea, again, connecting with the audience, not just communicating, keeping that kind of subset of theme in mind is very important for whenever you're teaching students. They have to be able to perform in that capacity, because you are going to be presented with meetings, you are going to be presented with business development. in some way, shape, or form, you are going to have to communicate effectively, thinking about perceptions, but also at the same time, keeping in mind maybe high context and low context cultures. And maybe this, I'm not sure if this will maybe go into the next question, perhaps, but it might further relate to on how we translate in terms of negotiation.
Actually, this is exactly what I wanted to touch. This is so important because negotiation skills are, well, not everyone is a diplomat, right? And unfortunately, many people are very, they are reluctant to learn these cultural things. And I just wanted to ask you why this is so important, just maybe in a few sentences, for everyone, regardless if you're a professional, academic, dean, resident of university, successful entrepreneur, why this is so essential to learn, to have that understanding of negotiation skills. And maybe we can just look into diplomacy a little bit here, why diplomatic tact and manners are also the part of communication here, because as you, I'm sure that you've mentioned this in your book, and as many of our audience know, that it's not only what we say, it's how we say it. It's our manners, it's our gestures, it's verbal, nonverbal, everything together. What do you think, Professor Bullock?
Yeah, of course. Like everything comes down to really understanding people's needs and wants, right? And sometimes it's very hard to get to the root of that, right? Because some people are going to kind of shield those and maybe only share certain aspects. Negotiations is really a game of emotions, whenever you think about it. It is a psychological process at the same time. There must be some capacity for this give and take approach, right? And we have to teach our students on how to do that. It's not just living in a world where I take everything and you get nothing, right? It's more about creating this win-win collaborative aspect at the same time. And going back to that key word, value. So what value do you have to offer maybe the other person? And how might you incentivize in a sense, but you're building mutual capacity to reach something great at the same time, this interdependence, right? So working together in order to achieve something great is very important. And I know Professor Sanchez has something as it relates to this win-lose negotiation construct as it relates to win-win. Professor Sanchez?
Sure, and I think this is a great question. As you mentioned, so we don't always readily see this. We think negotiators tend to be in the field of law or going up to again, governmental organizations. But that we do want to shift, as Professor Bullock said, to a win-win mindset, not a win-lose. And those are the two paths that we tend to arrive at initially when we're entering this skill and practice. And we're going into the win-win path. We're thinking about value creating, not value claiming, right? And we're turning our competitors into partners. And this is important not just for mutual understanding that leads to more productivity, but mutual understanding that leads to, as you mentioned, diplomacy and world peace. And this win-win mindset, again, we can connect it to some practical tips. One is, instead of negotiating items in a sequence, which we tend to do, we think of itemizing things in a series. When we're doing a win-lose negotiation, if we're doing win-win, we might start to negotiate in parallel. In other words, putting all issues on the table and then deciding together collectively which ones you want to trade first with our new partner. And so, being a win-win negotiator doesn't mean that we're soft negotiators, right? We used to prize the hard negotiator that was aggressive and, was manipulative, but the soft negotiator is too accommodating. What we really want to think about is the creative negotiator. The creative negotiator is collaborative. That's the new focus, right? Thinking about collaboration in the globalized world, because now our world is so interconnected. We do want to turn competitors into partners. We do want to think about creating high value solutions that benefit both parties.
And maybe if I could,
Yes, sir, go ahead, Professor Buck.
Sorry, I just think it's also very important as well to maybe just contextualize these terms of high context and low context cultures, because whenever you're becoming a global communicator, it's very important to recognize the differences between this. Now this is based off of research by Gert Hofstede, right? So Edward T. Hall, and then later on Gert Hofstede. But Edward T. Hall is considered the father of intercultural communications, right? So for example, this term low context cultures really comprises the whole aspect of being very explicit, being individualistic in how you're presenting yourself, or being at the same time like very direct, right? And we know, for example, about 30% of the world operates in this way. So for example, we could say the US, parts of Canada, because language does affect things, right? And we know French is spoken there as well. North Central, and Northwestern, Europe, Scandinavia, Australia, all tend to kind of function in this manner, right? But whenever we look at the opposite side, so the opposite side being high context cultures. So this tends to resonate more where these cultures are more implicit with information, where it's maybe a little more indirect, right? It's more collectivist in terms of decision making. Now, again, 70% of the world comprises a large majority of Latin America, for example, the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, large swaths of Asia tend to operate in this way. And knowing on how to shift between our messaging, so to speak, so going back to those 4 communication elements, audience, purpose, message, and value, I think are so important. And sometimes it gets lost in translation, literally, right? But the idea is always bringing it back to that in terms of this communicative aspect of how we are going to shape and sculpt our messaging so it resonates with the appropriate audience. I think is very important, especially in terms of negotiations. Whenever we're talking about other aspects of vocalics and the way that we use our voice to stress certain percentages, for example, I just think it's an important point that sometimes gets lost in translation, but it's important to define.
And just to boil it down, even just in a few sentences, I think this is so important. Professor Bullock mentioned is that, because Professor Bullock says this a lot in our trainings, that negotiation is you're essentially dealing with expression of needs and wants. And so in any field you're in, just thinking about these 2 patterns that Professor Bullock mentioned, one pattern tends to be direct, and then one pattern tends to be indirect. Imagine how challenging that is in a negotiation where you're expressing needs and wants, and some are expressing it indirectly and some are expressing it directly. It can be quite challenging. And so the idea is with that win-win approach, direct negotiators start to become more adaptable, more aware, thinking about reading more between the lines, thinking about being patient with gentle follow-up requests for decisions. And indirect negotiators tend to be, then they learn to be more clear, to say, even if we can't give a specific answer now, we'll give a specific time frame. And so again, that win-win approach, it goes back to the adaptability we mentioned at the beginning. That's what cultivates the adaptability that we need. If we're in a win-lose mindset, we just tend to think in a power mode as a negotiator. We're not even thinking about adapting our communication style. We're just trying to get to the power agreement. But if we're thinking win-win, then that's when we start to consciously or unconsciously cultivate that adaptability and shift our style of communication and also heighten our awareness.
This is incredibly insightful because we can see the shift in leadership. Like leadership 20 years ago was more aggressive, dominant, and now it's more collaborative, it's more team building, it's more on creating solutions that will benefit everyone for a win-win situation, right? So this is exactly where we think about executives, leaders, we think about people that are effective communicators, and leadership and effective communication goes very closely one with another. And what I wanted to ask you is, do you believe that certain countries, we've obviously covered this just a few minutes ago, that certain countries have high context, low context, and depending on this, strategies in communications are very different. And what are certain examples, if you could just share with our audience, maybe just absolutely opposite examples that certain communicative strategy would work effectively in this region and would completely fail in the other?
Sure. So maybe I can just kick things off a little bit. So for example, if we think of specific regions in the world, right? So we know, for example, that Northwestern, North Central Europe tends to be more low context, right? So very direct, explicit, at the same time, very monochromatic, right? So being on time, efficiency is very important, traditionally speaking. We have to keep in mind, though, that whenever we're talking about cultures, these are cultural conventions over time. So things are continually evolving. Again, to avoid stereotyping, because people can easily see that as that. Right? So it comes down to perception. Now, for example, let's say we have somebody, let's say from Germany, right? And then we have another individual, let's say that's maybe from Spain, because the Mediterranean region tends to function in a more high context, more like maybe implicit manner, depending on the situation. It could be situational. And we know that, for example, this Mediterranean region, as well as many other high context cultures, tend to operate in a polychromatic format where there's some flexibility in time. Now, if we have individuals, let's say they're having a negotiation, since that's what we were talking about earlier, we have to be mindful in how we're presenting the information. If we have to shift the time, for example, it's the way that we frame it. And going back to what I was saying earlier in terms of how we frame information, it's about positioning it in such a way, maybe with proximity. Proximity could be with location, it could be with ideology, the way that we might want to connect with the other person, right? So again, the way that we might, let me think, like in terms of build out whatever message that we're trying to communicate. If somebody from Spain is trying to connect with somebody from Germany, it's going to probably be more diverse and filled with stories, right? Just because of the way that we look at cognitive psychology, the uptake of information, right? The build out of information. Whereas we know somebody from Northwestern, North Central Europe is probably going to want a lot of the main idea at the very beginning. So we have to be able to adapt. Just like Professor Sanchez was saying, if we are trying to communicate with somebody who's from a different context between high and low context cultures, we have to adapt to make sure that we are maybe putting the main idea at the beginning, or we are sharing it maybe at the end. Maybe we share the details first, and then we put the details at the end, depending on whether the other individual or group of individuals is low context or high context cultures.
This is essential because many students, while they're like, let's see certain element of our audience is students, and they're watching us right now and talking about them. These are some very important skills because once they understand how to operate in different markets, this can enhance their leadership skills. That is their path to a better career, better opportunities, better ways. And my next question is about what would you believe are the high order negotiation skills that students should learn in the globalized era? We've just covered this, but what are the key elements that maybe key 3 or 5 elements that are essential for every student to learn?
That's a great question. And I think Professor Bullock covered a big chunk of it, and I'll add to it that, being aware again of these, these two larger communication style patterns. And so, for example, whether it is negotiation or something else, but in negotiation, I think it turns to crystallize more, being aware of how other cultures express disagreement, right? Some cultures will say no, other cultures will say maybe, and the maybe actually in fact means no. So being aware of, those nuances, and again, going back to high context cultures and low context cultures, these are terms that Edward T. Hall coined. And essentially high context means, it tends to be more driven in terms of relationship orientation, right? So there's a lot of context. And, an email, for example, will start with questions about family, questions about, personal exchanges, and then at the end will be the request. Whereas in a low context culture, low context means that there's just less context focused on the task, not the relationship. The email will be short, just focused on the task efficiency, and and it'll be right at the beginning, not at the end. And so I think for students, being aware of these cultural patterns, whichever part of the spectrum you tend to fall on, can be a game changer, because I've seen students say, for example, writing in English might be challenging because of the grammar. And then I say, no, actually it's mastering the rhetorical pattern, thinking about putting the idea first rather than at the end. Or if you're in an Eastern culture, then you have to think about restructuring. And we've trained a lot of US professionals, and you can't just say, here's the contract, thanks. You have to have some context prior. If you're writing a proposal or, some sort of memorandum, then you want to build that context first and have the main idea at the end. And so being aware, not just of the linguistic elements in terms of the words, but being aware of the organization of ideas. And we see this all the way up to the level of the UN. There were studies for UN at the UN in the Security Council meetings, And one aspect that I remember was U.S. and Syrian representatives, and the study was in terms of linguistics, the transcripts. What sort of cultural differences existed, or diverse communication styles in terms of persuasion. And the U.S. representatives tend to use a factual style, which goes right along with what we were saying, appeals to logic, which contrasted with the sort of effective, intuitive style of the Syrian representatives, which relied more on emotional appeals. And so, just being aware of these different cultural dimensions can be life-changing, and also, again, in communicating effectively with other people, but also seeing how you can become aware of your own style, and then adding different styles to your repertoire, but also learning, oh, okay, if I'm just thinking about the audience, then I might use an indirect approach here or a direct approach here. Neither is worse or better than the other, but you're just adding these to your toolbox.
And thank you very much, because this is essential for everyone. These are the key tools to effective communication, and being able to see the context, to operate in different contexts with flexibility, to respect the context of others is very important. My next question is about mirroring, and it's a very different and very interesting tactic that you've described in your book. Could you please tell us a little bit more about what is mirroring and why this is so important? To the use of mirroring is important in building trustworthy relationships.
So yes, and so mirroring, essentially what you're doing with mirroring is you are changing your style, communication style, to be closer to the styles of others, to be closer to the style of the person you're communicating with. And once we do this, we can not just better communicate with one another, but we can better understand one another. And there's studies, and going back to Gert Hofstede, who Professor Bullock mentioned, he's a social psychologist renowned in this field. There were past studies that were utilized from his work, from researchers at Stanford, at Cornell, and even Yahoo did a component to this. And basically what they found is that countries prefer to email other countries who share economic and cultural similarities. And so what's striking about this is that, on the one hand, we need to better our intercultural communication so this doesn't happen. But on the other hand, it shows something a little bit deeper, that by changing our style to adapt to the style of others, we can better communicate with others. And so this is called mirroring. And this does, it's something that, in our trainings has come up a lot. We've had people ask us, but how can, if I do this practice, do I lose myself? Right? Do I lose my sense of self, who I am? What are my communication preferences? And, sometimes if you think of your romantic relationship, right, the least fulfilling thing would seem to be that you have to control or modify your own behavior, and that's going to be a satisfactory relationship. We tend to think other people have to adapt to us. That's the relationship I want with my partner, right? But in fact, once we adapt to the communication styles of others, this is when we're showing, as you mentioned, that essential value, that every person is as important as you are, right? You are showing that we recognize the uniqueness of someone else, that, we want to have a reciprocal relationship, that it isn't just based on our preferences, but we want to incorporate the goals and preferences of others. And this is a key to not just intercultural effectiveness, but interpersonal effectiveness as well. So mirroring, while it does seem that you're again changing your style, you're in fact adding more styles, you're adding more tools, and then you're ultimately even a better communicator.
It seems like mirroring is like adding more layers.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, it doesn't change your essence. It just gives you more colors. So this is exactly what our audience that is young, that are students, need to learn, because it's not about, I can see that many young people, they are very reluctant to change their communication style, and this is a big problem, but it doesn't mean that they kill their individuality. They don't kill their personality. They are, if anything, enhancing it, making it more flexible, making it even more colorful, let's say. Professor Bullock, and I know that you have something to add on mirroring.
Sure. Like I also just wanted to break it down a little bit in terms of emailing. So emailing is dialogic. And what we mean by that is we are carrying out dialogues, except in a digital format, right? So there's an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Just like we hear whenever students are writing papers, we probably share a lot of that information. But the idea is that we are building a collaborative chain for an exchange, right? The idea is that, and you've touched on it exactly, like, so we have to adjust our communication style between what we talk about in terms of these 4 primary reader communication styles: being expressive, being analytical, being amiable, or being a driver. And all of those have specific characteristics that kind of fold into it. If you really assess and you look at what's in the email, whether somebody's using exclamation points pretty often, or maybe they are being very detailed in terms of the use of jargon, right? A lot of these are clues. And teaching our students to look out for these clues can make them better communicators across cultures, more global markets and things like that, because there's not necessarily a fully dedicated class. There might be a workshop, right? But there's so much richness in terms of understanding diction and the way that we form phrasings in different cultures, as well as the way that we might move clauses around. And as you can see, the linguistics is coming out, right? But the idea is we want to remain aware of that, and we want to pass that on to our students so they can go out and do great things as well whenever they're communicating via email. Because let's face it, many of us have inboxes that just get filled up nonstop, just from the weekend returning on Monday, something like that. The idea is that we have to be at the capacity to be able to mirror back and forth, to shift between these 4 different styles that we outline based off of something that we've researched into is social styles theory by David Merrill and Roger Reed. Now, this was primarily for in-person communication, for managerial communication, and maybe Professor Sanchez, if I missed something, feel free to add in. But the idea is that we're now applying it to digital communication, which is so important. It really hasn't been applied in that manner. And that's what we want to do, is we want to tease it out. We want to share these different aspects based off of qualities of assertiveness versus responsiveness as we build this rapport. Again, going back to the whole concept of we're trying to connect, not just communicate, but to connect.
This is a very important point, and I believe this is a certain summary. We do not just try to communicate, we try to connect. This is brilliant. And my last question, I know the conversation today has been extremely insightful, and I cannot believe that the time is just like it's been like 10 minutes. But the most important thing here is actually you've touched so many things, and especially in your book, there is a span of cultural strategies and techniques. And what is one essential takeaway you want to leave with our audience regarding global communications that are effective?
Professor Bullock, do you want to start this one?
Sure, like I can start off with this one. And it might go back to something I said earlier, like framing. I'm a big fan of framing, and teaching students on how to frame information better is very, very important today. It holds a certain weight or significance in terms of whether you connect with somebody or you don't. Whether it's along the lines of novelty, it could be proximity is something else that we talk about. At the same time, emotions, you've heard us talk a little bit about that as it relates to negotiations. We hear a lot of controversial aspects out there. Stories are made through controversy, right? So being able to pick out these details and identify how we are framing information. Now, we can use many of these together, right? But the idea is just to leave like kind of a final takeaway is being aware on how you're using framing, right? Because the idea is you are trying to create these feedback loops. You are trying to perhaps build community within a message or a series of messages. And there's a number of learning moments within that. But I would have to say that one of the key takeaways is just being able to frame consciously, right? And at the same time, frame with a sense of mindfulness going into the situation. Everything we talked about today in terms of low context and high context, lots of things to think about. But communications is so rich in terms of being a psychological process that we have to be aware of these different caveats or different subcategories. Anytime that we're forming an email, anytime that we're presenting, anytime that we are trying to stand up and advocate for something. So that would be my takeaway.
This is a very powerful takeaway, and I definitely after this interview, I will download and get your book, because this is just incredible treasure of communication tools that will help me in effective communication. Thank you so much for shedding the light on this. And to you, Professor Sanchez.
Sure. No, and I'll mention one that I feel in this moment, sitting in this chair, that I'm thinking about. I've been thinking about pretty recently, is the idea of risk, which we do mention in the book. But this is something that students, professionals has come up a lot in terms of communication, because communication is a risk. But what is bravery, right? What does it mean to be brave? That's something I personally have been thinking about, because we think of bravery as what we put out there in the world, what we are expressing, what we are saying. But bravery is actually also not just, output, but it's also input. Right? Are we taking risks in terms of what we take in, right? What information we take in, what other people we meet, what other experiences that we have, beyond just thinking about output. And so, closing back to the beginning, we talked about service. This is really what it comes down to. Even though we are going out there, we're doing all these strategies, we still are at that crux of service. This is the most powerful way we can create meaning in our lives and others' lives. Professor Bullock, and this is something that he inspired, that we wrote about in the book, thinking of ourselves as torchbearers. In the Olympics, we have that tradition where the torch is being passed among world societies. And this is what we're doing metaphorically. We're passing the torch of our ideas in service to others. And this really is when the communication becomes humbling, and we think of it more as, as an act of responsibility to our audiences. It has nothing to do with something that is self-serving. And I think, those shifts, those mindset shifts, are really how you start to empower audiences, empower others, and of course, have a pivotal shift in perspective that brings us closer as an interconnected society, and hopefully leads to the idea of the International Space Station, leads to innovation and progress.
This is a brilliant summary of today's interview, and I really hope that this will lead to global peace as well, because in turbulent times like today, the effective communication is the key to build peaceful world. And I'm very grateful to Professor Dan Bullock and Professor Raul Sanchez for your amazing contribution to today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. It was a pleasure to be here. We really enjoyed speaking with you. I love you had a beautiful summary of what I said. I think I want to replace my answer with yours about the colors and sort of this kaleidoscopic view, because I think that's also the key to intercultural communication, is adding more layers, as you said, adding more colors to your palette, and that expands yourself. So yes, very much enjoyed it. Thank you for having us.
And thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Appreciate it.